Hello everyone, Ryan Newell here once again for the Africa Digital Media Academy, and today we're in motion and we are going to be looking at shapes and some shape styles and some custom shapes and some lines, and just basically making sure we're all on the same page for how to work with shapes and custom shapes and lines. So the first thing I want to point out is down here is our little shape tool button. And we can click and hold for rectangles, which draws rectangles, and circles, which draw circles, and lines, which draw lines. So these are the three default ways to create basic shapes that are, common shapes you might want to use. So the first thing to point out again is that if I select, for instance, let's say the rectangle, and I click and drag, it will allow me to make any shape that I want. If I hold down Shift, then it makes both the height and the width the same, so that will make a square for a rectangle. Or if I were to do the same thing with a circle, as you can see here, I can make this circle, any shape I want, but if I hold down Shift, then it makes it a proper circle, not an oval or an ellipse. So Shift is an important one to remember. The other thing to keep in mind is drawing from the center. So for instance, let's say I have the circle again, and here's my point. If I draw out like this, it's going to have the top left of the circle drawing out. But if I hold down Alt, then it draws from the center. So Alt is also an important one, so that if, for instance, I know that I want the center of my circle to be, let's say, right where my arrow is, then I select the, so let's say I want the center to be right here. If I hold down Alt, and of course hold down Shift, now I'm making a perfect circle right from that center point. So those are some important ones to remember when drawing shapes with your circles and with your rectangles. The Shift and the Alt buttons are important. Now, of course, with lines, if you hold down Shift while you're drawing a line, it will draw in 45-degree increments. So there's this and this and this, whereas of course if I let go of Shift, I can do any angle I want, and Alt does not do anything when you are drawing a line. So that's just a quick review of drawing those shapes. So now let's actually make a shape and start playing around with it. So let's take our circle here, let's go roughly in the middle, hold down Shift and Alt, make a nice circle, and here we have our circle. So much like text, you can do certain things with outlines. You can put an outline on this if I wanted to. I could change the color. I could increase the width. So just like text, you can change some of the options here. Now, we're not going to get too much into this today. I just wanted to point that out because some of this stuff, you're actually going to be treating this as a brush stroke, and we're going to get into brush strokes in a future lesson. But just to keep in mind that outline is an option. But the one thing I want to point out is for fill here, instead of color, we can change this to gradient. And once we have a gradient, we can go in and, you can see there's some options here. If I move this gradient down, you can see there's actually the ability to change the gradient by moving these color swatches, which helps you kind of navigate the different gradients. I can change this gradient type to maybe burnt ember, and now you can see there's even more colors here that allow me to move things around. But one thing I want to point out is it's kind of a little bit difficult sometimes to edit in here when you want to just visually edit it on the actual canvas. So the way to visually edit gradients on the canvas is to go down to this tool and choose Adjust Item. And while we have our circle highlighted and Adjust Item, now you can see I can move this and go move it over, and maybe you want to go like this, and you can see my different colors here are represented on the slider, so I can slide these around quite easily. Now this top part here, this is opacity and this is color, so I can move my colors, or if I hold down Option and click, so let's say I click right here, you can see I've added another opacity. Now white is opaque and black is less opaque or transparent. So because both of these swatches are white, it doesn't really look like it's doing anything, because the white swatch is saying, hey, this is 100% opaque, this is 100% opaque, so you see it 100%, see it 100%. Well, that's not going to change. But if I right-click on this, let's right-click, and let's choose something dark, so a dark color, okay, so black. Now, this is saying this is transparent and this is opaque. So when I move this around, or I can move it here, you can see I'm actually going to move the opacity. So let's move the opacity all the way to the start there, but then let's make it start being less opaque. So now you can see I'm actually changing the opacity. So white, fully 100% opaque. Black, fully 100% transparent. And of course, I can move the gradient between the two using this. So this is just a really cool visual way to affect the gradient, keeping in mind, you can affect the colors on the one side, and if you hold down Alt, you can actually add swatches, and then right-click on swatches and change the colors, move the opacity. So you can really add any colors here by holding down, once again, Alt, clicking, it adds a swatch. I can add another swatch here. I can change this opacity to something else. So opacity is between blacks and whites. So whites, blacks. So that is how you can change different opacities, different colors. The other thing I wanted to point out is that it doesn't have to be a linear gradient. If I switch this to radial, you can see it actually makes it a circle. And now here is my one circle here, and here is my other circle. And if I want to maybe move this opacity out, so now we're seeing all the different opacities, or get rid of it. So there you go. I can delete. So if I don't like this blue, I could just grab it and take it off, and now there you go. I've removed that blue just by grabbing and dragging it off. Or I can go up to here and I can click on it, and I can click on this and I can drag it off, and when I drag it off, it deletes it, so I can delete different points on the gradient. So gradients are really quite powerful. So that's just wanted to show you gradients in the different fill here. So now let's get to creating a custom shape. So we've seen circles, we've seen squares, we've seen those two things. Let's create a custom shape. So let's just delete this. And to create a custom shape, you select the Bezier tool here. And with the Bezier tool selected, if I just click and make points and just click, you can see I'm making these points. And when I move my mouse over top of that first point, you see there's a little circle there? When I click that, that creates the custom shape. Now, there's a couple things we can do with this custom shape. One is under Inspector and Shape and Geometry. You can see we can actually start changing the roundness of the object. And if I just zoom in here, just so you can get a better sense of what's going on, you can see here, as I affect the roundness, it actually will make these points either less or more round. And I can even move individual points here in the inspector, so I can actually adjust it this way. Now, of course, I can have my edit points selected here, and I can move these around and do that. Or I can even hold down Alt, and you'll see it gives me a little plus button, and I can add another point. And then with that point, now I can do it this. So I can do that. I can, of course, go in, and once I have these different points selected, I can even do things like go in the style here and change, again, fill, make it an outline if I wanted to, take off the fill. Now it's a line. So you can definitely do a lot of different things here. I can, of course, change this from a linear point to a smooth point, and those, remember the Bezier curves from our other lesson with keyframes. I can move this Bezier point around, I can right click And of course I can break the handles and then really start making this an interesting custom shape. The other thing I wanted to point out is when drawing a custom shape, if I go back to the Bezier tool here, if I click and then click and drag, of course I can create a Bezier curve right off the bat. So that's another way to create curves in your shapes. And of course you always want to, when you're finished, go back and click, and you'll see these are all rounded. This one's not rounded. If I right click and go smooth, now it's rounded as well, and I can change this. So these are just different ways of creating different shapes and outlines. Now let's take one last look at the line tool, because the line tool is a really interesting one. Of course, one thing I also point out is if I select a point here, if I want to delete it, now it's going to create get rid of that point. So for instance, with my edit point selected here, if I were to highlight control point 6 and hit delete, now it's going to delete it. So you can also delete your different points if you want, just to change your shapes. So let's take one last look here at the line tool. So I'm just going to go here, select line, and I'm just going to drag. And I'm going to hold down shift so it's totally perpendicular here. Remember, if you hold down shift, it'll snap at 45 degrees. So like this. Now you'll notice when we draw a line here, instead of having fill, there's this outline option. And that's where things can get really interesting. So let's just zoom in here and move this around. So of course we can do things like change the opacity and width of the line so we can make it really wide. We can even do things like the end cap. So right now, see how this is round and this is round? We can change the start cap to maybe a square, and maybe we want to change the end cap to an arrow. And just like that, you can see here, now we've got some different options for the arrow. So we can do the arrow length or the arrow width. And we can do the first point offset or the last point offset. Now, one thing I want to point out is if we have our edit points selected here, is that I can go in and hold down the option key, and if you see here, I can actually, and if it's hard to do, I'll zoom in, I can actually add a point here. So I'm going to add a point like this, and when I do, it is going to, sometimes a little tricky, there we go. So I'm going to add a point. It's really hard to do with my trackpad here. If you're having trouble adding, sometimes you can just zoom right in, and when you zoom right in, it makes it a little bit easier. So I have my Alt key selected. You'll see there's a little plus there. If I click, now you'll see we've added another point to our line, and if I move this point, you'll see now it's actually making a second point here. And this is where the option for the joint, you'll see how it's rounded like this? I can change this to square. Now it's a square. Or I can go and change this to bevel. And now it's cut off here like that. So the joint option allows you to change how the arrow looks. And of course, if I don't like that, I can select my control point and I can hit delete if I want to. That's one way to get rid of that. Of course, we can go into geometry here, and we can change the roundness of the point here that we selected. We can also change individual points if we want to get very accurate here with these options, or of course with the edit point selected tool, we can just click and we can drag like that. So there's definitely quite a few options here for making custom shapes and lines and how those lines look and gradients. And so that was just a real quick look at shapes in motion.